Here's a question most people never think to ask themselves. Not do I have diabetes, but what was happening in my body in the years before people get diabetes? Because that window, the quiet stretch before a diagnosis, is not empty. It is not neutral. And for a lot of adults over 40, it is already happening. This is education, not medical advice. Always talk to your doctor about what's right for you. Let's start with something that sounds reassuring, but isn't. You get your labs back, blood sugar is in the normal range, or maybe just slightly elevated, nothing your doctor seemed alarmed about. You feel tired, but you've been busy. You've gained a little weight around your midsection, but who hasn't at this age? You sleep okay, more or less. No dramatic symptoms, no red flags. So you file it away. Not a problem yet. And that right there, that not yet, is exactly the gap this video is about. Because here's what the research has been showing for years and what the American Diabetes Association reinforced again in its 2026 Standards of Care. Prediabetes is not a waiting room. It is not a placeholder for a future problem. It is an active metabolic state, one that has already started shifting the way your body processes energy, stores fat, and regulates blood sugar. The reason most people miss it isn't because they're not paying attention. It's because the signals don't look like what metabolic trouble is supposed to look like. We've been trained to wait for the dramatic thing, the high number, the formal diagnosis, the doctor sitting us down with a serious face. But the earlier signals, they look like fatigue after lunch. They look like being hungry an hour after you ate. They look like belly fat that doesn't respond the way it used to. They look, in other words, like everyday life after 40. Reflective question number 1. If the earliest metabolic warning signs look like normal aging, how would you know the difference? That's the question this video is built around. Not to alarm you, not to send you into a spiral of self-diagnosis, but to give you a sharper lens for something that is worth understanding early, because early is exactly when it matters most. We're going to walk through what prediabetes and insulin resistance actually look like before the lab numbers turn. What's really happening inside the body during that window. What signals deserve more attention than they usually get, and why the evidence suggests that acting earlier, not waiting for a diagnosis, is where the real leverage is. Stay with me. This one builds. So let's talk about what's actually happening. Your body runs on glucose. Every meal you eat, whether it's a bowl of oatmeal or a piece of bread or a handful of almonds, eventually gets broken down into glucose, which enters your bloodstream. And insulin, a hormone made by your pancreas, acts like a key. It unlocks your cells so glucose can get in and be used for energy. That system works beautifully when everything is calibrated. But here's where it starts to shift. Over time, and this can happen gradually over years, sometimes decades, your cells begin to respond less efficiently to insulin's signal. The key still fits in the lock, but the lock has gotten stiff. The pancreas notices, so it does what it's designed to do. It produces more insulin to compensate, more keys for a stiffer lock. For a while, this works. Blood sugar stays relatively stable. Your annual labs look fine. Nothing alarming shows up. But here's what's happening beneath that normal-looking surface. Your insulin levels are elevated, your cells are working harder than they should be, and your body is burning through extra effort just to keep blood sugar in range. That effort has a cost, and that cost accumulates. This is insulin resistance, and it is the core of the prediabetes story. If your body can maintain normal blood sugar while insulin resistance is building, what would actually tip you off that something is shifted? Now, here's the myth that gets people into trouble. Most people assume that metabolic problems begin when diabetes is officially diagnosed, that the line between fine and not fine is the moment a lab number crosses a threshold. Before that line, you're okay. After it, you have a problem. But that's not how the biology works.
Insulin resistance doesn't start the day you get a prediabetes diagnosis. It builds, often over years, before any number crosses any official threshold. And during that building phase, the body is already sending signals. They're just not the signals we've been taught to watch for. The fatigue that hits an hour or two after a meal, that's your blood sugar spiking and then dropping faster than it should. The hunger that returns too quickly after eating, that's your cells not getting the fuel they expected, even though you just ate. The fat that accumulates specifically around the midsection rather than elsewhere, visceral fat, the kind that wraps around your internal organs, that's directly linked to insulin resistance in the research. Not just weight gain, not just aging, a specific pattern. And here's one that surprises a lot of people: skin changes. Small, dark patches in skin folds, the back of the neck, armpits, inner thighs, a condition called acanthosis nigricans. It's not common in everyone, but when it shows up, it's one of the more visible signs that insulin signaling has been disrupted for some time. None of these signals alone confirm anything, and that's exactly the compliance point worth making clearly. These are patterns worth bringing to a doctor, not patterns to self-diagnose from. What the evidence does show consistently is that these signals can appear well before the official numbers, which means there's a window, a real window where the conversation with your doctor can happen earlier, where monitoring can begin, where lifestyle changes, if appropriate, can have more impact than they would later. The NIH's National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases has been direct about this for years. An estimated 80% of people with prediabetes don't know they have it, not because the signs aren't there, because no one connected the dots. Here's where it gets more nuanced and more useful. Because if you ask most people why someone develops insulin resistance, the answer they've heard is simple. You eat too much, you move too little, you gain weight. That's the version that's been repeated for decades, and it's not wrong exactly, but it's incomplete in ways that matter. Let's start with sleep, because this one gets underestimated almost every time. Research has shown that even relatively short periods of poor sleep, we're talking a few nights of reduced or disrupted sleep, can measurably reduce insulin sensitivity, not because of what you ate, not because of how much you moved, because of how your body managed glucose during sleep or didn't. Deep sleep in particular plays a role in how your cells reset their response to insulin overnight. And for adults over 40, sleep disruption isn't just about staying up late, it's about sleep apnea, which is significantly more common in this age group, and which most people with it don't know they have. Untreated sleep apnea creates exactly the kind of chronic, low-grade stress on the body that accelerates insulin resistance. The connection is real, and it runs in both directions. Then there's cortisol. Chronic stress, and here we're not talking about occasional bad days, but sustained, low-grade stress that a lot of adults in their 40s and 50s carry as a baseline. Chronically elevated cortisol directly interferes with insulin signaling. It prompts the liver to release more glucose into the bloodstream.
It promotes fat storage in the abdomen. It disrupts sleep. And disrupted sleep elevates cortisol further. It's a loop, and it's one that can accelerate metabolic drift without a single change in diet or exercise. Reflective question 3. If sleep quality and chronic stress can independently move the needle on insulin resistance, what does that change about how you think about your own metabolic picture? Now let's talk about something the research has been refining: the difference between what the standard labs catch and what they might miss. A fasting glucose test gives you a snapshot, your blood sugar level at one point in time after you haven't eaten. A hemoglobin A1C gives you a 3-month average. Both are useful. Neither one tells you what happens to your blood sugar after a meal, which is often where the earlier disruption shows up. Some people have perfectly normal fasting glucose in A1C, and yet their post-meal blood sugar spikes significantly higher and takes longer to return to baseline than it should. This is called impaired glucose tolerance, and it can exist for years before fasting numbers move out of the normal range. It's one of the reasons researchers and clinicians have been paying more attention to what happens after you eat, not just before. This doesn't mean everyone needs continuous glucose monitoring or advanced testing, but it does mean a conversation with your doctor about the full picture, not just the standard panel, can be genuinely informative for people who have other risk factors in the mix. And that's where the second layer of this story matters. Because insulin resistance doesn't develop in isolation, it tends to cluster. Elevated triglycerides, lower HDL cholesterol, slightly elevated blood pressure, excess abdominal fat. These four things together, plus elevated fasting glucose, form what's called metabolic syndrome. And you don't need all five to have meaningful risk. Even 2 or 3 of these patterns showing up together tells a story that's worth taking seriously. The important nuance here is that none of these individually is a diagnosis. Elevated triglycerides can have other causes. Low HDL can reflect diet or genetics. The value is in the pattern, and in bringing that pattern to a clinician who can evaluate it in the context of your full history. What the evidence consistently shows is that the earlier this conversation happens, before A1C crosses into pre-diabetes range, before fasting glucose becomes a flag, the more options are on the table. Lifestyle interventions studied in programs like the Diabetes Prevention Program have shown meaningful results in people who were identified early. The leverage is not equal at every stage. Earlier genuinely matters here. Let's bring this to something practical. Not a prescription, not a checklist of things you have to change by Monday, but a clearer picture of what this information is actually useful for and what a smarter next step might look like for you specifically. The first thing worth saying clearly, if anything in this video resonated, if you recognized patterns in yourself or in someone close to you, the right move is a conversation with your doctor, not a Google search, not a self-diagnosis based on symptoms, a conversation with your actual labs in front of you, with a clinician who knows your history. That conversation is more useful if you come prepared, and here's what prepared looks like in this context. Ask about fasting glucose and hemoglobin A1C. Most standard panels include these, but if yours didn't, they're worth requesting. Ask about fasting triglycerides and HDL cholesterol, not just total cholesterol, but those two specifically, because their ratio is one of the cleaner indicators of insulin resistance that standard panels already include.
Ask about waist circumference. It sounds almost too simple, but abdominal fat measured at the waist is one of the more consistent predictors in the research, and it costs nothing to check. If you have 2 or more of the metabolic syndrome markers we discussed, elevated triglycerides, low HDL, elevated blood pressure, elevated fasting glucose, significant abdominal fat, that's a pattern worth naming explicitly in the appointment. Not to alarm your doctor, they may already be tracking it, but to make sure it's being looked at as a cluster, not just as individual numbers. Reflective question number 4. Of the signals and patterns we covered today, which one, if any, made you want to ask a different question at your next appointment? Now let's talk about what the evidence actually supports in terms of early action. The Diabetes Prevention Program, one of the most replicated studies in metabolic health, showed that people with pre-diabetes who made moderate lifestyle changes reduced their risk of progressing to type 2 diabetes by about 58% over 3 years. That's not a supplement, that's not a medication, that's 150 minutes of moderate physical activity per week, brisk walking qualifies, combined with modest dietary changes, and in some cases, structured support from a health program. The key word in all of that is moderate, not extreme, not a complete overhaul, moderate, sustained, consistent. Resistance training deserves a specific mention here because it's often left out of the pre-diabetes conversation. Muscle tissue is one of the primary sites where glucose gets absorbed after a meal. More functional muscle mass means more capacity to clear glucose efficiently. The ADA's 2026 Standards of Care specifically added emphasis on resistance training alongside aerobic activity, not as a replacement, but as a complement. Sleep is not optional in this conversation. If you have symptoms of sleep apnea, snoring, waking unrefreshed, daytime fatigue that doesn't match your sleep hours, that's worth evaluating, because treating sleep apnea has been shown to improve insulin sensitivity independently of other changes. It's not a lifestyle fix, it's a medical evaluation that has real metabolic implications. And stress, chronic background stress, is worth being honest about. Not because stress alone causes diabetes, and not because the solution is simple, but because the cortisol connection is real, and because managing it, whether through structured downtime, sleep, movement, or professional support, is part of the same picture. Here's what this all adds up to. Prediabetes is not a warning light that means the car is about to break down. It's a signal that the engine has been running harder than it should for a while, and that there's still time to adjust before the wear becomes structural. The people who do best with this information are not the ones who panic, they're the ones who get curious, who bring a better question to their next appointment, who start paying attention to patterns they were previously filing under just aging. You don't have to have all the answers today. You just have to be willing to look more carefully at what your body has already been trying to tell you. If you're experiencing symptoms that concern you, or if you have a personal or family history of diabetes, please reach out to a qualified healthcare provider. This video is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for individualized medical advice. And if this kind of careful, evidence-based conversation about health after 40 is something you want more of, this channel exists exactly for that. Subscribe if you haven't already, not because of an algorithm, but because the next video will be worth your time. What signal from today's video surprised you most? Leave it in the comments. I read them, and the patterns in your responses often shape what we cover next.